Hey guys, tonight we're going to pull back the curtain on one of the best kept secrets in European history, ancient wedding night rituals. Imagine for a moment that you're walking through the cold stone corridors of a medieval castle, where the air smells of incense and fresh blood, and where every dancing shadow on the walls tells a story that history books prefer to omit. Tonight, you're going to witness ceremonies that would make even the most daring documentarians blush today. This story might solve mysteries you didn't even know you had about why your grandmother insists you save your bridal bouquet, or why certain marriage traditions feel inexplicably unsettling to you. So, before we explore this story together, take a moment to help me by subscribing to the channel, liking and sharing this video, or maybe leaving a comment below, but make sure you only do it if you genuinely like what I'm bringing you. I'd love to know where and when you started watching this video, or if you have any compliments to share about how these stories keep you company on your restless nights. Now, let's keep the lights as low as possible. We'll turn on the fan for a soft sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a villa in northern France, in the year 1347. The plague hasn't arrived yet, but a strange tension is already in the air. It's the wedding night of Marguerite de Montclair and Philippe de Bracieux, two young people who met exactly 3 hours before the ceremony. You watch from the shadows as two powerful families prepare to seal not just a marriage, but a contract that could change the fate of 3 generations. In the castle's main room, torches cast shadows that dance like restless spirits. But there are no rose petals romantically scattered on a canopied bed. Instead, you find a makeshift altar where a ceremonial knife rests next to a stained silver goblet. Historians have meticulously documented these blood-sealing rituals, where noble families literally mixed their blood to create bonds that transcended death itself. The knife you see isn't just any weapon. It was forged specifically for this ceremony by a blacksmith who swore to fast for 7 days before working the metal. Its Latin inscriptions invoke St. Michael the Archangel, but also include symbols that any modern archaeologist would recognize as pre-Christian. This hybrid of sacred and pagan traditions was typical of medieval Europe, where new beliefs were superimposed on ancestral customs without completely replacing them. Marguerite, barely 16, wears a dress that cost more than the annual salary of 20 peasants. But what really catches your attention are the gold threads woven into the fabric, each one blessed by 3 different priests and a local druid who officially doesn't exist, but whom all the nobility consult in secret. Her mother has sewn small amulets inside her corset wolf teeth for fertility, cold iron against evil spirits, and a relic of St. Barbara that supposedly protects during childbirth. The room gradually fills with witnesses, but they aren't just curious relatives. Each person present has a specific role in the ritual that is about to begin. The royal scribe will record every detail on parchments that will be kept in the family archives. The court physician will later inspect the sheets to confirm consummation. 3 expert matrons will verify the bride's physical state before and after the ceremony, and an elderly priest, whose true name no one remembers but whom everyone calls Father Knight, will pronounce blessings that mix ecclesiastical Latin with Celtic enchantments. Philippe carries on his belt a dagger that belonged to his great-grandfather, a veteran of the Crusades. The blade still has dark stains that the family swears are Saracen blood, although modern historians suspect it's more likely rust mixed with blood from previous family ceremonies. Historians still debate whether these daggers had true magical value for their bearers or simply represented dynastic continuity. But documents from the time reveal that many noble families considered them as important as their crowns. The air thickens with the smoke of exotic incenses. It's not the sweet scent you associate with modern churches, but a pungent mixture of Middle Eastern resins, local herbs, and something that smells disturbingly like burning. An Italian nun who visited the court wrote years later that these aromas seem designed to alter the senses and prepare the soul for supernatural experiences. When the clock tower strikes midnight, the true ritual begins. Philippe takes the ceremonial knife, but before proceeding, he must recite an oath that his ancestors have repeated for 12 generations. The words are a mix of Old French and Latin, but they include phrases that no linguist has been able to fully translate. Some academics suggest they are remnants of pre-Roman Gallic dialects, secretly preserved by noble families who never completely abandoned their pagan roots. Marguerite extends her left hand over the silver goblet. The cut must be specific, a clean slash on the palm that forms a straight line from the index finger to the wrist. Too shallow, and the ritual loses power. Too deep, and the bride could bleed to death. Father Knight has instructed Philippe on the exact technique, because this old man has presided over similar ceremonies for more than 40 years. Marguerite's blood falls into the goblet with a metallic sound that echoes in the absolute silence. But it's not common blood. For the 3 days prior, she has consumed a specific diet of herbs and potions prepared by the local healer. Her blood now has a darker colour and a strange scent that some witnesses describe as earth after rain mixed with hot iron. Philippe follows the same procedure, although his preparation has been different. The men of his lineage fast for a week before these ceremonies and consume only wine mixed with oak bark and wild honey. His blood mixes with Marguerite's in patterns that seem to form symbols on their own, as if the drops were following a predetermined design. When they both drink from the cup alternately, their faces reveal a mixture of nausea and trance. The metallic taste combines with residues of the herbs they have consumed, creating a sensory experience that several chroniclers of the time described as a journey to the threshold between worlds. Some participants reported visions during these rituals, although the official church always attributed them to religious fervour rather than supernatural experiences. The blood ritual is just a prelude to what truly obsessed medieval families the public verification of purity. You watch as the three matrons approach Marguerite with a solemnity that rivals any religious ceremony, their faces, weathered by decades of witnessing these intimate moments, show no emotion. They have perfected the art of turning female anatomy into a legal document. The European obsession with female virginity reached levels we would consider absurd today, but which at the time determined the survival of entire lineages. The white sheet test wasn't just a tradition. It was a blood-sealed contract that could annul marriages, unleash wars, and redistribute fortunes. Historians have documented cases where the lack of physical evidence on the wedding sheets led to marriage annulments that changed the political map of Europe. Marguerite is led behind an embroidered silk screen while the matrons perform their preliminary inspection. Their instruments include polished silver mirrors, ivory probes, and flasks of aromatic oils that supposedly reveal bodily secrets. The head matron, a woman who has served 5 generations of nobles, examines not only physical integrity, but also less obvious signs: the colour of certain tissues, the texture of the skin, even the body's natural scent. Historians still debate whether these inspections had a real medical basis or were purely ritualistic, but legal documents from the time reveal that the matron's testimonies held more weight in court than the confessions of the bride and groom themselves. An experienced matron could determine not only if a woman was a virgin, but how much time had passed since her last intimate relationship, information that could destroy reputations and alter inheritances. While this happens, Philippe must submit to his own form of scrutiny. The men of his family examine him for signs of marital vigour, the firmness of his handshake, the colour of his cheeks, the steadiness of his voice when reciting family oaths. Although it seems ridiculous, these men genuinely believed they could predict male fertility through these external indicators. The wedding sheet waiting on the bed is no ordinary fabric. It has been woven specifically for this occasion by nuns from a local convent, using linen grown in blessed lands and bleached under 12 consecutive full moons. The threads have been individually blessed, and small protective symbols have been embroidered in the corners with pure gold thread. This sheet cost more than an entire peasant's house, but its true value lay in its ability to capture the truth of the wedding night. What is particularly disturbing is how these verifications turned into community spectacles. You watch as the most prominent guests form a kind of impromptu jury, whispering about what constitutes sufficient evidence. Some nobles carried special magnifying glasses to examine the stains in greater detail. Others consulted manuals written by experts in female anatomy, treatises that mixed real medical observations with completely invented superstitions. The verification process could last for hours. The matrons not only looked for blood, but also other indicators they considered relevant to the exact position of the stains, their specific colour, even their scent. Every detail was meticulously recorded on parchments that were kept in family archives alongside wills and land contracts. These purity records could be consulted decades later during succession disputes. Marguerite, aware that dozens of eyes are watching her indirectly, must bear not only the physical pressure of the moment, but also the weight of knowing that her value as a person will literally be measured in drops of blood. The women of her time developed secret strategies to ensure satisfactory evidence, from consuming certain herbs that increased bleeding to more drastic techniques they preferred not to document openly. A particularly macabre practice was the use of substitute blood when natural evidence failed. The most corrupt matrons carried small flasks of lamb's blood mixed with herbs that imitated the human scent. Some families desperate to preserve marital alliances paid fortunes for these clandestine services. Archival documents reveal at least 3 cases where brides were instructed to discreetly cut themselves during the marital act to produce the expected evidence. The most unsettling aspect of these rituals was how they transformed intimacy into a performance. Philippe and Marguerite know that every gesture, every sound, every moment of their first night together will be analysed at dawn by people who consider their bodies to be family property. The psychological pressure was so intense that many noble marriages developed permanent sexual dysfunctions due to the trauma of these public verifications. The matrons finally emerge from behind the screen with satisfied expressions. They have declared Marguerite fit for the sacred marriage, and have applied special oils to her skin that supposedly increase the chances of conception. These oils, prepared according to recipes jealously guarded by guilds of healers, contained everything from genuine aphrodisiacs to completely inert substances whose only power resided in the faith of those who used them. The wedding bed is now the absolute centre of attention. The white sheet is spread out like a blank canvas where the fate of 2 families will be written. The guests form a respectful but vigilant semicircle around the bed, like witnesses to a contract that transcends the merely human. On their faces, you can see a mixture of morbid curiosity, religious devotion, and political calculation that perfectly defines the complexities of the medieval nobility. The atmosphere in the room suddenly changes as Father Night begins to scatter mysterious objects around the wedding bed. You watch in fascination as this old man, whose trembling hands contrast with the precision of his movements, places amulets that look more like they came from medieval nightmares than from Christian ceremonies. His collection includes bear claws preserved in amber, saints' bones that no official church recognizes, and stones engraved with symbols that predate the Latin alphabet by millennia. The magical objects hidden in medieval wedding chambers revealed a Europe where official Christianity coexisted uncomfortably with pagan traditions that refused to die. Under Marguerite and Philippe's mattress, the matrons have placed a boar's tooth wrapped in red silk, supposedly to protect against male impotence. In the corners of the room, small leather pouches contain mixtures of blessed salt, cold iron, fennel seeds, and something that smells suspiciously of sulphur. The most unsettling of these protections is a wax figure the size of a doll, moulded to represent a demon with exaggerated sexual features. This grotesque creation is not meant to invoke evil forces, but to repel them. Artisans specializing in nuptial protections created these objects following traditions that mixed Christian alchemy with ancestral witchcraft. The theory was simple but disturbing. Lustful demons would be attracted to the wax figure instead of the real newlyweds. The superstition surrounding these ceremonies reached levels of paranoia that would seem comical to us today if they weren't so genuinely terrifying for those who lived them. Marguerite has a silver amulet sewn into her underwear in the shape of a serpent biting its tail, a symbol that medieval alchemists associated with eternal fertility. Philippe wears an iron chain around his waist, invisible under his clothes, which supposedly protects him against the evil eye aimed at his virility. Historians still debate whether these practices represented genuine faith in the supernatural or simply psychological mechanisms to handle the anxiety of wedding nights. But archival documents reveal that even the most educated nobles of the era spent fortunes on these protective amulets. A 14th century inventory lists more than 200 magical objects found in a single wedding chamber, including fake relics, stones blessed by hermits, and potions that promised everything from instant fertility to eternal love. Father Knight now recites blessings in what sounds like Latin, but includes words no monk would recognize. His deep voice echoes through the room as he sprinkles holy water that contains more than simple river water. The secret ingredients include drops of dew collected from cemeteries, oil from lamps that have burned in pagan shrines, and ashes from parchments with prayers written by nuns who officially never existed. A particularly macabre tradition was the placement of spectral guardians around the marriage bed. These were not physical objects, but spirits invoked through specific rituals to protect the couple's intimacy. The process required the participation of local mediums who, although persecuted by the official church, were secretly consulted by the most powerful families. These specialists in the supernatural promised to create invisible barriers that would prevent lustful demons from interfering with the marital consummation. The strangest objects were the truth stones, crystals that supposedly changed colour in the presence of deceit or infidelity. Marguerite must hold one of these stones for several minutes while Father Knight evaluates its coloration. Modern science explains these changes as reactions to body heat and moisture, but at the time they were considered divine revelations about the moral purity of the participants. In a corner of the room, barely visible in the shadows, rests a collection of flasks containing liquids of suspicious colours. These passion elixirs were prepared by a clandestine network of alchemists who operated on the fringes of medicine, magic, and quackery. Their ingredients range from genuine aphrodisiacs like ginseng and damiana to completely invented substances whose only power resided in the faith of those who consumed them. The room is also protected by circles of salt discreetly drawn on the floor, invisible unless you know where to look. These circles follow geometric patterns that combine Christian symbolism with sacred geometry inherited from Druidic traditions. Specialists in protective architecture charged extraordinary sums to design these configurations, promising that their patterns would channel positive energies toward the wedding bed while repelling evil influences. Margaret notices that her mother has hidden small obsidian mirrors in the curtain surrounding the bed. These volcanic mirrors, imported at great cost from distant lands, supposedly reflect malevolent intentions back toward those who send them. The shiny black surface of these objects creates unsettling optical effects in the torchlight, multiplying the shadows and creating the impression that the room is populated by invisible presences. The most disturbing moment comes when Father Knight produces a human skull, decorated with inscriptions in alphabets that no one can translate. This relic, supposedly belonging to a martyred saint, must be kissed by both newlyweds as a guarantee that their union will last beyond death. The metallic taste of the ancient bone mixes with residues of the potions they have drunk, creating a sensory experience that several participants described years later as kissing the threshold of the underworld. The banquet preceding the marriage consummation is anything but a conventional gastronomic celebration. You watch as servants present dishes that seem to have been designed more by alchemists than by traditional cooks. Every bite has been carefully calculated to stimulate fertility, increase sexual desire, and ensure that the first night together produces the heir both families so desperately need to secure their political alliances. The first course consists of fresh oysters brought from the Norman coasts in ice barrels, but they aren't simply served with lemon. Each oyster has been sprinkled with a mixture of honey, cinnamon, and powdered rhinoceros horn imported from Africa at a cost equivalent to the annual salary of 10 artisans. Medieval nobles genuinely believed that consuming the sexual organs of powerful animals transferred those qualities to humans, a tradition that led to the extinction of several large European mammal species. Marguerite must consume a special soup prepared exclusively for brides, whose recipe has been secretly guarded by generations of cooks specializing in reproductive gastronomy. The ingredients include finely chopped ram testicles, grated mandrake root, and quail egg yolks mixed with spiced wine. The taste is indescribable, but manuscripts from the period promise that this specific combination guarantees not only conception, but also that the first child will be a male. Philippe faces his own gastronomic challenge, a pie made with hare liver, groundnuts, and an herb known as dragon's blood, which is actually the red resin of a Mediterranean tree. The cooks have moulded this pie into a shape that any modern observer would immediately recognise as a phallic symbol, but which at the time was considered an artistic representation of male vital force. The guests applaud every bite that Philippe manages to swallow, as if it were a demonstration of virility. Historians have documented wedding banquets where more than 50 different dishes were served, each with supposed or real aphrodisiac properties. The hosts competed to present the most exotic and expensive ingredients: nightingale tongues in a sauce of ground pearls, lamb brains with oriental spices whose names no one could pronounce correctly, and jellies prepared with animal parts that modern cookbooks would refuse to mention. Historians still debate whether these exotic ingredients had real pharmacological effects or worked purely by suggestion, but participants' testimonies suggest that many experienced genuine side effects, from dizziness and visions to states of excitement that lasted for days. A 13th century chronicle describes a wedding banquet where several guests had to be sedated after consuming a soup prepared with hallucinogenic mushrooms imported from the Alpine mountains. The official drink of these banquets was fertility wine, a mixture that combined expensive vintages with additives we would consider dangerous today. The recipe included belladonna extract to dilate pupils and create an appearance of sexual excitement, cantharides powder, the infamous love powder, which is actually a toxic insecticide, and tinctures of plants that modern herbalists would classify as controlled poisons. A particularly disturbing aspect of these banquets was the participation of specialized tasters who sampled each dish before serving it, not only to detect poisons but also to evaluate its aphrodisiac potency. These individuals, usually elders with decades of experience, could supposedly determine if a specific mixture would produce the desired effects. Their verdicts could alter entire menus and occasionally led to the disqualification of cooks who had spent months preparing their secret recipes. The guests not only consumed these exotic dishes, they also participated in gastronomic rituals that transformed the food into almost religious ceremonies. Each dish was individually blessed by Father Night, who sprinkled the food with consecrated oils while reciting prayers that mixed Christian supplications with incantations that sounded older than Christianity itself. Marguerite notices that the other diners are watching her intently as she eats, evaluating her appetite as an indicator of her sexual readiness. Women of the time learned from a young age that their manner of consuming certain foods would be interpreted as a sign of their intimate nature. Eating too fast suggested excessive lust. Too slow implied frigidity. Refusing any dish could be interpreted as a symbolic rejection of the marriage itself. The most elaborate confections included fruit sculpted into explicit anatomical shapes, cakes decorated with fertility symbols, and sweets moulded to represent reproductive organs with a realism that would seem obscene today. Artisans specializing in nuptial confectionery developed sculptural techniques that rivaled religious art in complexity, but served completely different purposes. The culminating moment of the banquet came when the newlyweds had to share a special cup filled with a mixture that combined their own blood with spiced wine and secret ingredients. This nuptial communion symbolically sealed their union before physical consummation, but it also introduced a combination of substances into their systems whose combined effect could significantly alter their experience of the approaching night. The true public nature of medieval wedding nights is revealed when the last dishes of the banquet are cleared, and the most disturbing ritual of all begins: the ceremonial bedding. You watch with a mix of fascination and horror as the most basic intimacy of two human beings becomes a spectacle supervised by dozens of witnesses whose presence is not optional but legally required. This is not voyeurism. It is dynastic protocol where every intimate moment has political implications that can alter the balance of power across Europe. The process begins with the arrival of the masters of nuptial ceremonies, 3 men whose sole job is to ensure that every aspect of the marriage consummation follows protocols established over centuries. Their faces, hardened by decades of witnessing these intimate moments, show no emotion as they unroll parchments that detail every step of the procedure. These documents, written in legal Latin mixed with archaic medical terminology, specify everything from the exact position of the torches to the prayers that must be recited during specific moments of the marital act. Marguerite is led to a side room where a group of noble ladies, headed by the Duchess of Brittany, will prepare her for the matrimonial sacrament. This preparation goes far beyond a simple change of clothes. Her entire body is anointed with oils that have been blessed by 7 different priests, each specializing in specific aspects of human fertility. The oils, prepared according to recipes dating back to the Carolingian era, contain ingredients ranging from rose petals grown in monasteries to extracts of animal glands that Arab merchants sell at astronomical prices. Historians have documented cases where these preparations lasted more than 3 hours, during which the bride was subjected to inspections so detailed that some testimonies describe them as medical examinations performed by committees of experts in female anatomy. Every mole, every scar, every physical peculiarity was meticulously recorded in documents that were archived alongside the marriage contracts. This documentation could be consulted years later during succession disputes or investigations into the legitimacy of heirs. Philippe faces his own form of public scrutiny. The men of both families surround him in a ceremony that combines medical inspection with a male initiation ritual. His father must publicly certify that his son is physically capable of fulfilling his marital duties, a declaration that requires direct visual examination of his anatomy. The older uncles and cousins evaluate not only his physical condition but also his mental state, looking for signs of nervousness that might interfere with consummation. The official witnesses include representatives from 3 institutions: the Church, the Crown, and the involved families. Each group has specific interests in verifying that the union is completed satisfactorily. The ecclesiastical representative must confirm that no canonical laws are violated during the process. The royal envoy verifies that the political alliances sealed by this marriage are properly honoured. The family delegates protect the economic interests of their respective clans, ensuring that every contractual detail is fulfilled literally. The wedding chamber is transformed into a kind of theatre, where the bed becomes the main stage. The curtains that would normally provide privacy have been replaced by translucent silk panels that allow observation without full exposure. The witnesses position themselves in a semicircle around the bed, each with a specific role. Some record observations on official parchments. Others hold torches to ensure adequate lighting, and a few carry medical instruments in case any complication arises. Historians still debate whether these witnesses truly observed the full sexual act, or simply verified that the newlyweds lay together appropriately. But several manuscripts from the period suggest that at least some nobles required direct observation to prevent marital fraud. A 14th century chronicler wrote that, "The great lords do not trust appearances when it comes to perpetuating their lineages, and therefore demand visual evidence that their marital investments have been properly consummated. The bedding process follows a specific ritual that has been perfected for generations. First, Marguerite is escorted to the bed by the matrons, who adjust her bridal nightgown to ensure appropriate access while maintaining required modesty. Then, Philippe is led by the older men, who whisper last-minute instructions to him about techniques that supposedly guarantee the conception of male heirs. The ceremonial sheet is inspected once more before the newlyweds lie down. The witnesses verify that there are no previous stains, holes, or defects that could compromise the validity of the evidence expected to be found at dawn. A special official, known as the guardian of the sacred sheet, has the exclusive responsibility of protecting this textile throughout the night, ensuring that it is not altered or replaced by fraudulent versions. The most tense moments occur when the newlyweds are finally left alone under the distant but constant supervision of their observers. The witnesses cannot speak during this period, but they maintain communication through coded gestures they have developed specifically for these occasions. A raised eyebrow means proceed according to protocol. A hand movement indicates more illumination required, and certain more discreet gestures can completely halt the process if something seems to go wrong. Marguerite and Philippe must bear not only the physical and emotional pressure of their first intimate experience, but also the constant awareness that every sound, every movement, every facial expression is being evaluated by people whose judgment will determine the success or failure of alliances that have taken years to negotiate. The psychological weight of these expectations was so intense that many noble marriages developed permanent sexual problems that affected not only their personal happiness, but also their ability to produce heirs. The protocols even specify the sounds that are considered appropriate during consummation. Too much silence can be interpreted as a lack of passion or physical problems. Too much noise can suggest improper behaviour or loss of control. The newlyweds have been instructed on the volume and type of vocal expressions expected of them, turning even their most natural reactions into calculated performances to satisfy outside expectations. The duration of the act is also subject to evaluation. Water clocks strategically placed in the room allow witnesses to measure the elapsed time, information that will be recorded in official documents. A process that is too brief may suggest male dysfunction. Too prolonged can be interpreted as consummation difficulties that could indicate anatomical problems or physical incompatibility between the spouses. When the consummation finally ends, the witnesses do not withdraw immediately. First, they must perform preliminary inspections of the physical evidence, document their initial observations, and seal the room to prevent alterations before the official morning evaluation. Only then, after hours of constant supervision, are Marguerite and Philippe finally left alone, although armed guards remain outside the door to ensure that no one enters or leaves until dawn. The Catholic rituals that transform the marital bedroom into a sacred space began days before the wedding, when monks specializing in spiritual architecture arrived to consecrate every corner of the room where the union would be consummated. You watch as these clerics, whose robes are marked with symbols that do not appear in any official liturgical manual, sprinkle holy water mixed with sacred oils in geometric patterns that cover floors, walls, and ceilings with a precision that rivals the most elaborate pagan rituals. The process of sanctification requires the placement of authentic relics in specific locations around the wedding bed. These are not just simple bones of minor saints, but fragments of martyrs whose stories are intimately related to sacred sexuality and blessed procreation. A piece of St. Bridget's robe, patron saint of fertility, is discreetly sewn into the mattress. A splinter from the cross where St. Valentine supposedly died is embedded in the bed frame, and most disturbing of all, a flask containing drops of the Virgin Mary's milk, a relic whose authenticity no one publicly questions, but which everyone knows is impossible to verify. Historians have documented inventories of wedding chambers that included up to 30 different relics, each with specific properties to protect particular aspects of the Christian marriage. Saints' teeth protected against impotence, martyrs' hair guaranteed conjugal fidelity, and fragments of sacred vestments supposedly ensured that children conceived in that bed would be born free of original sin. The cost of acquiring these relics often exceeded the price of the marriage dowry, but noble families considered them essential investments to secure divine blessing on their lineages. Father Knight now produces a book that clearly does not belong to any official monastic library. Its pages written in archaic Latin mixed with symbols that seem to predate Christianity, contain prayers specifically designed to sanctify carnal union while honouring the sacred mysteries of procreation. These prayers include invocations to saints whom no pope has officially canonised, but whose cult persists in rural regions where pagan traditions merged with Christianity without completely replacing it. Historians still debate whether these texts represented heresies tolerated by the official church, or simply local traditions that ecclesiastical officials preferred to ignore. But archival documents reveal that even cardinals and bishops occasionally consulted these manuals for matrimonial ceremonies of particular political importance. The line between orthodoxy and heresy conveniently blurred when it came to securing alliances that benefited both noble families and religious institutions. The blessing of the wedding bed requires a specific ceremony where each component of the bed is individually consecrated. The sheets are sprinkled with holy water while the priest recites passages from the Song of Solomon that the official church rarely cites in public contexts. The pillows are anointed with holy oils prepared according to recipes that combine monastic traditions with herbal knowledge, that inquisitors would classify as suspicious if it were practiced by anyone who did not wear religious habits. The mattress itself must be blessed from within, a process that requires partially disassembling the structure to sprinkle the internal fibres with consecrated liquids. The monks specialising in these tasks carry instruments that seem more appropriate for surgery than for religious ceremonies: silver syringes to inject blessed oils, probes to ensure that every corner receives appropriate treatment, and hermetic containers that maintain the purity of the sacred liquids during processes that can last for hours. A particularly disturbing tradition was the placement of sacred seeds inside the wedding mattress. These were not seeds of ordinary plants, but blessed grains that had supposedly grown in soil watered with the tears of saints or water from miraculous springs. Farmers specialising in sacred crops charged extraordinary prices for these products, promising that their presence in the marriage bed would guarantee not only fertility, but also that the children conceived would inherit exceptional Christian virtues. The consecration rituals also included the creation of invisible spiritual barriers around the wedding chamber. These sacred boundaries, established through specific prayers and ritual gestures, supposedly prevented lustful demons or evil spirits from interfering with the consummation of the Christian marriage. The priests specialising in spiritual architecture developed techniques that combined sacred geometry with preventive exorcisms, creating spaces they considered immune to malevolent supernatural influences. The most solemn moment came when Father Night proceeded to bless the bodies of the newlyweds themselves. Marguerite must kneel while holy oils are applied to specific parts of her anatomy, a process that liturgical manuals describe euphemistically, but which in practice involved physical contact that would have been scandalous in any other context. Philippe receives similar blessings, although the masculine rituals emphasize strength and procreative ability more than purity and receptivity. The oils used in these bodily blessings contained ingredients ranging from simple, blessed olive oils to exotic mixtures that included whale sperm, beaver gland extracts, and tinctures prepared with animal parts that Mediterranean merchants sold specifically for use in religious ceremonies related to sacred sexuality. The official church maintained discretion about these ingredients, but monastic purchase records reveal transactions that would seem completely incongruous with religious life to us today. The specific prayers for these rituals included direct supplications for God to bless not only the spiritual union, but also the most physical aspects of the marital relationship. The texts, preserved in cathedral archives that are rarely open to researchers, contain explicit language about bodily functions and reproductive processes that contrasts dramatically with the prudish rhetoric we associate with medieval Christianity. These prayers treated sexuality as a divine sacrament that required detailed blessing and direct clerical supervision. The ceremony culminated when all the sacred objects placed in the room were activated simultaneously through a master prayer that Father Night recited, while holding a special relic, a fragment of Christ's manger, that supposedly guaranteed that any conception occurring in the presence of this relic would produce a child destined for great spiritual or temporal achievements. The cost of renting this relic for a single night exceeded the annual income of entire villages, but the most powerful families considered it an essential investment to ensure the success of their dynasties. The phenomenon of the charivari transformed wedding nights into community spectacles that could last until dawn, turning what should have been private intimacy into public theatre, where entire communities actively participated in the marital consummation of their neighbours. You watch from the castle windows as hundreds of villagers congregate in the outer courtyard, carrying musical instruments that seem designed more for auditory torture than for entertainment drums made from the skins of recently sacrificed animals, flutes carved from human bones, and horns that produce sounds that could wake the dead. The charivari tradition represented much more than simple community celebration. It was a system of social control where marriages had to be approved and supervised by the entire local community. The villagers not only celebrated unions they considered appropriate, but could also protest violently against marriages that violated unwritten social norms. A widower who was too old marrying a young woman, a widow who remarried too soon after being widowed, or any union that altered the local economic balance could provoke hostile charivaris that lasted for entire weeks. The instruments used in these community rituals included objects specifically designed to penetrate stone walls and reach even the most isolated bedrooms. The marriage drums were constructed with specially treated skins that amplified sound to levels we would consider harmful to the human ear today. The fertility bells were forged with metallic alloys that produced specific tones that supposedly stimulated sexual activity, although their real effect was to keep the entire region awake on the wedding night. Historians have documented charivaris that included up to 1,000 participants, organised into specialised groups that had specific functions during these nocturnal celebrations. The fertility singers chanted explicit ballads that detailed exactly what was expected to happen in the wedding chamber. The love musicians improvised melodies that followed the supposed rhythm of the newlyweds' intimate activity, and the marriage storytellers shouted stories about legendary couples whose sexual exploits had become local folklore. Historians still debate whether these community rituals truly facilitated marital intimacy, or turned it into a public performance, but participants' testimonies suggest that many couples developed permanent sexual problems due to the pressure of knowing that hundreds of people were audibly evaluating their performance. Some communities developed communication codes where certain musical rhythms indicated approval or disapproval of what was happening inside the wedding chamber. Participation in charivaris was not optional for community members. It was a social obligation whose fulfillment affected the status and reputation of entire families. Absentees were marked as antisocial or potentially subversive, while the most enthusiastic participants gained community prestige that translated into concrete economic and social advantages. This social pressure turned wedding nights into events where personal intimacy was completely subordinated to collective expectations. The rituals also included elements of competition between different community groups. Young bachelors competed to produce the most creative serenades, hoping to impress potential partners with their musical wit and knowledge of marriage traditions. Married women competed to demonstrate their wisdom about fertility techniques through songs that combined practical advice with superstitions inherited from previous generations. A particularly disturbing tradition was the practice of auditory sign reading, where experienced participants claimed to be able to determine the success of the marriage consummation simply by listening to the sounds emanating from the wedding chamber. These self-appointed specialists developed a specific vocabulary to catalogue different types of sounds and associate them with predictions about the couple's future fertility, sexual compatibility, and even the sex of future children. The most elaborate charivaris included theatrical performances where community actors dramatised scenes from legendary marriages, often with explicit content that would have been censored in any other social context. These performances served simultaneously as entertainment, sexual education for young people, and social commentary on marital expectations. The scripts of these plays, transmitted orally for generations, combined humour, practical advice, and elements that we would classify as folkloric pornography today. The duration of the charivaris depended on factors ranging from the social status of the newlyweds to the community's evaluation of the progress of the marital consummation. Noble couples could expect celebrations that lasted until dawn, while peasant marriages often ended when the participants decided they had fulfilled their community obligations. However, some charivaris would extend for days if the community decided that the couple needed additional encouragement, or if doubts arose about the validity of the consummation. The strangest instruments used in these rituals included horns of truth that supposedly could detect lies about sexual activity, drums of destiny whose rhythm predicted the couple's marital future, and bells of conception that, according to local tradition, only rang when successful fertilization occurred. Although these objects had no real magical properties, their use created psychologically intense atmospheres that significantly influenced the experiences of the newlyweds. Female participation in charivaris followed specific patterns that reflected the gender norms of the time. Married women led certain aspects of the celebrations, especially those related to fertility and sexual techniques. Young single women had more limited but crucial roles they were expected to observe and learn about marriage through these public spectacles, preparing for their own future wedding nights under similar community supervision. Charivaris also served as social control mechanisms where communities could express disapproval of marriages they considered problematic. Couples who had violated unwritten social norms could face hostile charivaris that included discordant music, insulting lyrics, and rituals designed to sabotage rather than celebrate the marriage union. These anti-charivaris could be so intense that some couples permanently abandoned their communities to escape the organised hostility. The secret herbal knowledge that medieval women managed in relation to their wedding nights constituted a clandestine science that combined empirical medicine with traditions dating back to pre-Christian cultures. You watch as Marguerite receives a small leather pouch from her mother that contains more power than many monastic libraries, a collection of plants, roots, and extracts that can control fertility, modify sexual desire, prevent diseases, and even alter the sex of future children according to beliefs that have survived centuries of religious persecution. Aphrodisiac herbs constituted only a small fraction of this secret botanical arsenal. Damiana, imported from distant lands at costs equivalent to annual salaries, was discreetly sewn into bridal corsets where body heat gradually released its active compounds. Siberian ginseng, so valuable that it was traded by the gram as if it were gold, was ground into an invisible powder that was sprinkled on intimate garments, and the herb known as serpent's tongue was boiled to create tinctures that brides secretly drank during the days leading up to their weddings. Historians have identified more than 150 different plants used specifically in medieval marriage rituals, many of which contained chemical compounds that modern pharmacology recognizes as effective for modifying reproductive functions and psychological states. However, knowledge about correct dosage, safe combinations, and side effects was transmitted exclusively through clandestine networks of women who risk accusations of witchcraft by practicing this unofficial medicine. Secret contraceptives represented the most dangerous aspect of this herbal knowledge. Women from noble families faced contradictory pressures. They had to produce heirs to secure political alliances, but they also needed to control the timing of their pregnancies to maximize strategic advantages. The moon herb allowed for delaying conceptions for specific months. The tea of the wise virgins could prevent pregnancies during periods when the political situation made it inconvenient to produce heirs, and the seeds of witches' tears worked as early abortifacients that simulated late natural menstruations. Historians still debate whether these contraceptive methods had real effectiveness or worked primarily through a placebo effect, but archival documents reveal that even queens and princesses regularly consulted specialists in women's medicine, whose services were paid for secretly through intermediaries to avoid political scandals. The testimonies suggest that some of these substances were genuinely effective, although also extremely dangerous when used incorrectly. The process of preparing these secret medicines required knowledge that went far beyond simple herbalism. The mistresses of the hidden garden had to understand lunar cycles, because many plants only contained maximum active ingredients during specific phases of the moon. They needed to know astrology, because certain extracts were considered effective only when prepared under particular planetary configurations, and they mastered basic alchemy, because the plant combinations required distillation and fermentation processes that transformed inert raw materials into potent medicines. Marguerite receives detailed instructions on the use of anticipation oils, extracts that were discreetly applied to the skin during the hours leading up to the marriage consummation. These oils contained compounds that increased tactile sensitivity, promoted muscle relaxation, and according to local traditions, increased the chances of successful conception. The application required specific techniques that mothers taught their daughters in private conversations that were never documented in writing. The most exotic plants in the collection included authentic mandrake root, whose acquisition required specific rituals because the plant was believed to scream when pulled from the ground, and flowers of nocturnal passion that only bloomed during lunar eclipses and had to be collected by virgins who subsequently swore to maintain absolute silence about their location. These substances were considered so powerful that their simple possession without ecclesiastical authorization could result in accusations of witchcraft. A particularly fascinating aspect of this herbal knowledge was the use of influence plants, species that supposedly could alter the behavior and preferences of male spouses. The fidelity herb was secretly mixed into meals to reduce male interest in extramarital lovers. The sweetness flowers were boiled to create perfumes that promoted gentleness in naturally aggressive men, and the seeds of control were used to prepare potions that supposedly made husbands more receptive to feminine influence in domestic and political decisions. The methods of administering these substances required considerable creativity to avoid detection. Some were incorporated into cosmetics that women applied routinely. Others were mixed with incenses that were burned during family religious ceremonies. The most potent were hidden in special jewellery with secret compartments that gradually released active vapours when heated by body heat. The exchange of herbal knowledge between women from different regions created clandestine trade networks that operated parallel to the official trade in spices and medicines. The merchants of secret gardens travelled discreetly between noble courts, transporting not only physical plants but also detailed instructions on the cultivation, preparation, and safe use of species that did not exist in the official catalogues of male doctors or apothecaries. The risks associated with this herbal knowledge were considerable. Women who mastered these techniques lived under constant threat of accusations of witchcraft, especially if their remedies worked too well or if something went wrong during their application. The courts of the Inquisition developed specific procedures to investigate herbal crimes related to sexuality and reproduction, considering these practices as evidence of demonic pacts rather than traditional medicine. The transmission of this knowledge from mothers to daughters constituted one of the most sophisticated educational systems of the medieval era. Although it operated completely outside of official institutions, the lessons included not only information about specific plants but also training in medical observation, diagnosis of reproductive problems, and psychological techniques for managing the complex emotional pressures of medieval marriage. This hidden curriculum prepared noblewomen to navigate aspects of their marital lives that no formal education addressed. European elites transformed their wedding nights into political performances so elaborate that they rivaled royal coronations, turning marital intimacy into theatre where audiences of foreign dignitaries, rival ambassadors, and local nobles evaluated not only the validity of family alliances, but also the relative power of different political factions. You watch as the wedding chamber of Marguerite and Philippe becomes a diplomatic stage where every visual detail communicates specific messages about the status, ambitions, and military capabilities of the families involved. The guest list to witness these political consummations included individuals whose presence had implications that transcended the immediate marriage ceremony. The ambassador of the King of France must personally verify that this alliance does not threaten royal interests. The Pope's representative evaluates whether the union complies with canonical guidelines that may affect future relations between the families and the Church. The envoys of rival families look for evidence of weakness or strength that they can exploit in later conflicts. Historians have documented wedding nights where more than 100 dignitaries occupied rooms adjacent to the wedding chamber, each with specific reasons to monitor the development of the marital consummation. These observers were not voyeurs. They were political agents whose evaluations would determine decisions about trade treaties, military alliances, and dynastic strategies that would affect the balance of power throughout Europe for generations. The preparation of these political spectacles required months of planning that involved everything from architects specializing in diplomatic design to musicians trained in strategic entertainment. The wedding chamber was redesigned to maximize both the privacy of the newlyweds and the observation capacity of the political witnesses. Special glass panels allowed visibility without a complete violation of intimacy. Acoustic systems amplified specific sounds while minimizing others, and the lighting was adjusted to create visual effects that dramatized particular aspects of the ceremony. Historians still debate whether these political performances truly facilitated international diplomacy or simply provided sophisticated entertainment for bored elites. But archival documents reveal that decisions about wars and peace were frequently made based on observations made during these theatricalized wedding nights. The ability of a family to orchestrate impressive matrimonial spectacles was interpreted as an indicator of their overall military and economic power. The theatrical elements included costumes designed specifically to communicate political messages. Marguerite wears jewellery that represents territories controlled by her family, each precious stone symbolising specific castles, ports, or trade routes. Philippe carries a ceremonial crown whose design incorporates emblems of all the allied families, visually communicating the extent of the support network that backs this union. Their clothes are embroidered with gold threads that form discrete maps of territories they hope to control through this marriage. The choreography of these events followed protocols as specific as those used in state ceremonies. The newlyweds had to move, speak, and gesticulate in ways that maximised the visual and symbolic impact of each moment. The observers occupied assigned positions that reflected both their political status and their roles in the diplomatic drama that was unfolding. The servants followed precise routines that provided necessary services while minimising interference with the theatrical aspects of the performance. A particularly elaborate tradition was the presentation of testimonial gifts during the most intimate moments of the marriage consummation. The dignitaries offered gifts whose value and nature communicated their evaluations of the political success of the union. Valuable jewellery indicated approval and a desire for continued alliance. Modest gifts suggested reservations about the future of the relationship, and the complete absence of gifts constituted a political insult that could justify future hostilities. The banquets that accompanied these spectacles included dishes designed to impress politically as much as nutritionally. The menus incorporated ingredients from all the territories controlled by the Allied families, demonstrating the geographical extent of their economic power. Exotic spices communicated commercial connections with distant lands. Rare wines suggested wealth sufficient to acquire luxury products, even during periods of scarcity. And the artistic presentation of the food rivaled the best creations of contemporary artisans. The music performed during these political events included original compositions that incorporated musical themes associated with the different families involved. The court composers created pieces that mixed traditional melodies from different regions, symbolising the union of territories that the marriage represented. The performers included not only professional musicians, but also members of allied families whose personal participation in the performances communicated their commitment to the alliances sealed by the wedding. The most theatrically elaborate aspects involved costume changes during different phases of the wedding night. Marguerite must change clothes multiple times, each outfit designed to highlight different aspects of her family's political relationships. Philippe similarly transitions between different ceremonial roles, from military commander to diplomatic negotiator to spiritual leader, each transition marked by specific clothing that communicates his evolving responsibilities as the new head of the expanded family alliance. The diplomatic observers maintained detailed records of every aspect of these political spectacles, from the precise timing of different ceremonial elements to evaluations of performer competency by both bride and groom. These documents, preserved in archives that researchers rarely access, provide insights into power dynamics that determined European politics during periods when marriage alliances were more important than formal treaties for maintaining international stability. The most sophisticated political performances included technological innovations that enhanced the dramatic impact of ceremonial elements. Mechanical devices created special lighting effects that highlighted symbolic moments. Acoustic engineering amplified significant sounds while muting distracting noise. And architectural modifications temporarily transformed private residences into theatrical venues that rivaled professional stages for creating memorable political spectacles. The defenders of the threshold constituted a tradition that transformed the protection of newlyweds into a specialized profession, where individuals trained specifically for these tasks established defensive perimeters, both physical and spiritual, around the wedding chambers. You watch as these guardians, whose skills combined martial arts with esoteric knowledge, position themselves strategically not only to repel human intruders, but also to keep at bay supernatural forces that supposedly threaten the successful consummation of important marriages. The training of threshold defenders required years of preparation that combined physical combat with studies in demonology, protective herbalism, and spiritual purification rituals. These specialists learned to identify different types of supernatural threats, from jealous spirits of former lovers to demons specifically attracted to sexual activity. Their armament included conventional weapons blessed with specific rituals, amulets forged with rare metals, and potions that supposedly made them invisible to evil entities while maintaining their ability to combat threats both mundane and supernatural. Historians have documented guilds of threshold defenders that operated throughout Europe, maintaining professional standards as rigorous as those required for doctors or lawyers. These guilds established territorial jurisdictions, regulated pricing for different types of protection services, and maintained libraries of specialized knowledge about supernatural threats specific to different geographic regions. The more experienced practitioners commanded fees that exceeded the annual incomes of minor nobles, reflecting both the perceived importance of their services and the genuine risks involved in their profession. The defensive perimeters established by these specialists followed principles that combined military strategy with magical theory. The physical defenses included hidden weapon caches, trap mechanisms that could incapacitate intruders, and communication systems that allowed for rapid coordination between multiple defenders. The spiritual barriers involved salt circles drawn with precise geometric patterns, mirrors positioned to reflect malevolent energies back toward their sources, and incense that supposedly repelled different categories of supernatural entities. Historians still debate whether these threshold defenders represented genuine supernatural practitioners or simply provided psychological comfort for anxious families. But documentary evidence suggests that even educated nobility took their services seriously enough to invest substantial resources in their employment. The contracts between families and defense specialists included detailed specifications about the types of threats to be countered, the duration of protection services, and the penalties for failure to fulfill protective obligations. The most sophisticated defensive operations involved multiple specialists working in coordinated teams. Threshold sentries maintained vigilance at specific entry points, each trained to recognize different categories of threats. Perimeter scouts patrolled wider areas surrounding wedding venues, watching for signs of approaching dangers both natural and supernatural. Interior guardians remained inside the wedding chambers themselves, ready to intervene if protective barriers failed to prevent malevolent intrusions. A particularly elaborate tradition involved the creation of sanctuary zones, where threatened newlyweds could retreat if primary defences were compromised. These refuges included hidden chambers stocked with necessary supplies for extended siege situations, communication devices for summoning additional help, and weaponry specially consecrated for combating specific types of supernatural adversaries. The construction of these safe rooms required architects who understood both structural engineering and the principles of spiritual fortification. The most experienced defenders often developed specializations in different types of threats. Some focused on jealous spirits of former lovers who might try to sabotage new marriages. Others specialized in combating demons of impotence, who supposedly attacked male virility during crucial moments. And the most feared were those trained to face envious witches, who used evil magic to cause sterility or complications during childbirth. The threat detection methods included techniques that combined physical observation with supposed supernatural perception. The defenders carried special crystals that supposedly changed color in the presence of evil energies. They used pendulums to identify directions from which invisible dangers were approaching, and they employed trained animals, especially black cats and crows, whose behavior supposedly revealed the presence of hostile supernatural forces. The specialized armament of these guardians included swords forged with meteoric iron that was considered especially effective against supernatural entities. Their shields incorporated protective symbols engraved with techniques that combined advanced metallurgy with alchemical rituals, and they carried special projectiles, arrows with blessed silver tips, darts impregnated with extracts of sacred plants, and small bombs that released fumes supposedly toxic to evil spirits, but harmless to humans. The emergency protocols established specific procedures for different types of crises. If human intruders were detected, the defenders followed conventional military tactics adapted to minimize disruption of ongoing marriage ceremonies. If supernatural threats were identified, they activated exorcism rituals that could last for hours while maintaining protective barriers around the newlyweds. And if the primary defenses failed, they executed evacuation plans that moved the couples to previously prepared sanctuary locations. A particularly unsettling tradition was the use of matrimonial decoys to confuse threats both human and supernatural. These decoys included actors who pretended to be the real newlyweds, complete with fake ceremonies performed in locations designed to attract hostile attention away from the genuine wedding venues. The decoys carried convincing replicas of the jewelry and clothing worn by the real brides and grooms, and their performances were so convincing that even experienced supernatural entities supposedly could be misdirected by these elaborate deceptions. The threshold defenders also provided post-crisis counseling for couples who had experienced threats during their wedding nights. These services included ritual purifications to remove any residual spiritual contamination, herbal treatments to address the physical effects of supernatural encounters, and psychological support to process traumatic experiences. The more severe cases required extended treatment that could last for months, during which time specialized healers worked to restore both physical vitality and emotional stability. The fees charged by threshold defenders varied dramatically based on perceived threat levels and the social status of the clients. Protecting minor nobility from routine supernatural hazards cost approximately the equivalent of a skilled craftsman's annual salary. Defending major political figures against coordinated magical attacks by rival families could exceed the costs of maintaining private armies for entire years, and the most elite practitioners commanded retainers that provided continuous protection services for entire extended families rather than just individual wedding ceremonies. The training facilities for threshold defenders were typically located in remote areas, where students could practice combating supernatural threats without endangering civilian populations. These academies maintained libraries of specialized knowledge about regional supernatural phenomena, weapon testing ranges where students learned to use consecrated armaments effectively, and simulation chambers where they practiced responding to different emergency scenarios under controlled conditions. The most successful defenders often developed reputations that transcended regional boundaries, leading to requests for their services from nobility throughout Europe. These international specialists commanded premium prices for their expertise, but also faced increased risks from powerful enemies who viewed their protective services as obstacles to achieving political objectives through supernatural means. Several documented cases exist of threshold defenders being assassinated by rival practitioners hired specifically to eliminate effective protectors from opposing factions. The rituals of exchanging bodily fluids took marital intimacy far beyond conventional physical consummation, transforming the union into a ceremony that literally mixed the vital essences of two people to create bonds that would supposedly transcend death itself. You watch with fascination and horror as Marguerite and Philippe participate in ceremonies that would have scandalized even doctors of their time if they had been publicly documented. Rituals that combined alchemical beliefs about the nature of life with pagan traditions about the magical power of bodily liquids. The blood exchange you witnessed earlier was only the beginning of a complex process that involved multiple fluids considered essential to sealing marriage unions of political importance. Saliva was considered a carrier of the vital breath that connected directly to the soul, requiring specific rituals where the newlyweds had to exchange this fluid through carefully choreographed sequences that mixed intimacy with religious ceremony. The specialized goblets used for these exchanges were crafted from materials believed to preserve and amplify the spiritual properties of mixed saliva jade to promote longevity, obsidian to enhance passion, and gold to ensure fidelity. Historians have found manuscripts that detail precisely how these fluid exchanges were supposed to create sympathetic connections between married couples. According to these theories, shared fluids retained permanent links to their original sources, meaning that harmful magic directed at one spouse would automatically affect the other through their shared essences. This belief system also suggested that positive influences, such as blessed oils or magical potions, could benefit both partners when introduced into either one's system. The most elaborate ceremonies involve collecting and preserving samples of various bodily fluids in specially consecrated containers that were then stored in family treasuries alongside important documents and relics. These vials of eternal union supposedly served as permanent records of marriage bonds that could be consulted during inheritance disputes or questioned during annulment proceedings. The more suspicious families commissioned multiple sets of these containers, with some hidden in secret locations to prevent tampering by rival factions. Historians still debate whether these rituals represented genuine spiritual beliefs or elaborate psychological manipulation designed to create stronger emotional bonds between arranged marriage partners. But documentary evidence indicates that even highly educated nobility participated seriously in these ceremonies. The detailed instructions preserved in family archives suggest that these practices were refined over generations, with specific modifications developed to address different political and spiritual requirements. A particularly disturbing practice involved the creation of composite essences, where fluids from both spouses were mixed with blood from sacrificed animals, blessed oils, and tinctures prepared from rare plants. These mixtures were believed to embody the combined spiritual powers of both families, creating literally new forms of life force that exceeded what either partner possessed individually. The preparation of these composite essences required specialized knowledge of alchemy, herbal medicine, and religious ritual that was typically possessed only by practitioners who operated on the margins between legitimate medicine and forbidden magic. The most intimate exchanges involved fluids that modern sensibilities would consider completely inappropriate for ceremonial use. However, medieval beliefs about the spiritual significance of all bodily secretions meant that substances modern culture associates exclusively with private biological functions were considered sacred materials worthy of ritual treatment. The specialized procedures developed for collecting, blessing, and exchanging these materials combined medical knowledge with religious ceremony in ways that created profound psychological impacts on participants. The timing of these fluid exchanges followed complex schedules based on astrological calculations, lunar phases, and seasonal changes that were supposed to maximize their spiritual effectiveness. The more elaborate ceremonies required months of preparation during which both spouses underwent purification regimens designed to enhance the quality of their bodily fluids. These preparations included specialized diets, herbal supplements, ritual bathing, and prayer sequences that were supposed to remove impurities and concentrate life force in the materials to be exchanged. The vessels used for these ceremonies were often masterpieces of artistic and technological achievement. Master craftsmen created goblets, vials, and other containers using techniques that combined metalworking, glass blowing, and gem cutting with ritual consecration that supposedly imbued the finished products with supernatural properties. The most expensive examples incorporated rare materials like unicorn horn powder, phoenix feathers, and water from sacred springs. Though modern analysis reveals that most magical ingredients were clever substitutes that created convincing visual effects without actual supernatural properties, the ceremonial procedures themselves required participants who combined medical knowledge with spiritual authority. The practitioners who performed these rituals needed an understanding of human anatomy to ensure the safe collection of bodily fluids, knowledge of preservation techniques to prevent contamination, and familiarity with religious protocols to properly consecrate the mixing ceremonies. The most respected specialists charged fees that reflected both their technical expertise and their supposed supernatural abilities. The psychological effects of participating in these intimate ceremonies were profound and lasting. Couples who had literally exchanged their life essences often developed unusually strong emotional bonds, though whether this resulted from genuine supernatural connections or simply from shared participation in highly meaningful ritual experiences remains debatable. The intensity of these ceremonies created memories that participants carried throughout their lives, influencing their attitudes toward marriage, family, and spiritual practice. The documentation of these practices was typically kept secret because the Catholic Church officially disapproved of rituals that seemed to attribute magical properties to bodily fluids. However, the practices persisted because even church officials occasionally participated in modified versions when political necessities required the strongest possible marriage bonds. The survival of detailed instructions in family archives suggests that these traditions continued for centuries despite official religious opposition. Dawn brings with it the most tense and scrutinized moment of the entire marriage ceremony, the official verification of the physical evidence that will determine not only the legal validity of the marriage, but also the political future of two powerful families. You watch as the matrons emerge from their adjacent quarters, where they have remained awake all night preparing the instruments and protocols necessary for an inspection that must be as meticulous as any criminal investigation, but as discreet as the most delicate diplomatic procedures. The head matron, a woman whose authority in these matters exceeds that of most court physicians, carries a collection of tools that seem more appropriate for a scientific laboratory than for a bedroom inspection. Her arsenal includes magnifying glasses crafted specifically to examine bloodstains, measuring devices to determine volume and distribution patterns, chemical reagents to distinguish human blood from animal substitutes, and reference materials that catalogue different types of evidence according to their significance for confirming marital consummation. The verification procedures follow protocols so detailed that they require written instructions spanning multiple pages. The sheets must be examined under specific lighting conditions that reveal stains invisible to casual observation. The patterns of blood distribution are analysed to determine whether they resulted from natural marital activity or were artificially created to deceive inspectors, and the chemical composition of any fluids found is tested using techniques that combine medieval knowledge of bodily functions with primitive forensic science. Historians have documented cases where these morning inspections lasted several hours, during which time the accused newlyweds waited nervously, while teams of experts debated interpretations of ambiguous evidence. The stakes were so high that entire libraries of precedent cases were maintained for reference during disputed inspections. The most controversial cases required testimony from multiple independent expert witnesses, whose evaluations were weighed against each other to reach final determinations. Historians still debate whether these verification procedures represented genuine medical expertise or elaborate theatrical performances designed to legitimize predetermined political decisions. But documentary evidence suggests that even powerful noble families feared failing these inspections enough to invest enormous resources in ensuring satisfactory results. The consequences of negative evaluations could include marriage annulment, loss of dowry payments, cancellation of military alliances, and permanent damage to family reputations. The most sophisticated techniques involved comparison of evidence found with samples prepared beforehand using blood from both spouses mixed under controlled conditions. These reference standards allowed inspectors to distinguish genuine consummation evidence from materials introduced by couples who had failed to achieve natural results. The preparation of these comparison samples required medical knowledge that pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable religious and social practice. A particularly macabre aspect of these inspections was the participation of blood readers, who claimed the ability to determine not only whether consummation had occurred, but also detailed information about the quality of the sexual experience, the emotional states of both partners during intercourse, and even predictions about future fertility based on subtle characteristics of the stains found on the bedding materials. These specialists charged substantial fees for their supposed expertise, although their actual abilities probably relied more on psychological manipulation than genuine analytical skills. The chemical tests employed during these inspections included procedures for detecting artificial additives that might have been used to create false evidence. The inspectors knew that desperate couples sometimes resorted to animal blood, red dyes, or other substitutes to produce satisfactory stains, and they developed increasingly sophisticated methods for identifying these deceptions. The detection of fraud could result in punishments that exceeded those imposed for simple failure to consummate marriages. The timing of these inspections was critical because certain types of evidence deteriorated rapidly, while others became more obvious with time. The matrons had to balance thorough analysis with the necessity of completing their evaluations before natural processes altered the materials they were examining. This time, pressure created additional stress for everyone involved and occasionally led to rushed evaluations that missed important details. The documentation of inspection results followed legal formats that required specific language and precise descriptions of all evidence found. These reports became permanent parts of family records and could be referenced decades later during inheritance disputes or investigations into the legitimacy of children born to the marriage. The language used in these documents was carefully chosen to be sufficiently explicit for legal purposes while maintaining appropriate discretion about intimate details. The most controversial aspect of these mourning verifications was the requirement that some family members witness the inspection process directly. Although this was officially to ensure transparency and prevent fraud, it also meant that private intimate details of the newlyweds' first night together became known to relatives who might use this information for political advantage in future family conflicts. The psychological trauma of this public scrutiny often affected couples' relationships for years afterward. The professional reputation of matrons who performed these inspections depended entirely on their accuracy and discretion. Those who developed reputations for fair and reliable evaluations became highly sought after by noble families throughout Europe. However, matrons who were suspected of corruption or incompetence could find themselves banned from practicing their profession, with consequences that extended to their entire families. The economic implications of these verifications were substantial, because significant financial transactions depended on their outcomes. Dowry payments might be forfeited if marriages were determined to be unconsummated. Military alliances could be cancelled if political unions were declared invalid. And commercial agreements between families might be voided if the marriages that secured them were found to be legally questionable, based on insufficient physical evidence. The pagan traditions that persisted under the veneer of official Christianity created a dual system where officially Catholic marriage ceremonies coexisted with ancestral rituals that dated back to Celtic and Germanic cultures that had never been completely eradicated by Christianization. You watch as elements that any inquisitor would classify as blatant heresy are integrated seamlessly with religious sacraments, creating hybrid ceremonies that satisfied both spiritual traditions while maintaining plausible deniability for families that needed to appear orthodox for political reasons. The Celtic symbols carved discreetly on Marguerite and Philippe's bed frame tell stories that predate the Christian presence in Europe by centuries. The spiral patterns represent the eternal cycles of life, death, and rebirth, that Celtic peoples associated with fertility and the continuity of family lines. The interwoven animal figures depict sacred creatures from pre-Christian mythology: stags for masculine potency, bears for protective strength, and serpents for feminine wisdom and reproductive power. These symbols were positioned where they would remain hidden from casual observers, but clearly visible to participants in intimate ceremonies. The hand-fasting rituals that preceded official Christian marriages involved binding couples' hands together with cords made from sacred materials, while they exchanged vows in ancient languages that most participants no longer understood completely. These cords incorporated elements that connected the ceremony directly to the natural world fibres, from trees considered sacred by Celtic peoples. Threads dyed with pigments extracted from flowers that bloomed only during specific seasonal transitions, and metals that had been blessed according to traditions that combined Christian prayer with incantations inherited from Druidic practices. Historians have identified more than 50 different pagan traditions that were routinely incorporated into medieval Christian weddings, often disguised as regional customs or family traditions rather than acknowledged as remnants of pre-Christian religious practices. These elements included everything from specific foods that honoured ancient fertility gods to architectural features that channeled supernatural energies, according to beliefs that long predated Catholic theology. The seasonal timing of many wedding ceremonies followed calendars that reflected pagan agricultural cycles rather than Christian liturgical schedules. Marriages performed during Celtic cross-quarter days supposedly inherited extra spiritual power from cosmic alignments that ancient peoples associated with enhanced fertility and divine blessing. The preparations for these seasonally timed ceremonies included rituals that honoured both Christian saints and pre-Christian nature spirits, creating syncretic practices that satisfied multiple spiritual traditions simultaneously. Historians still debate whether these hybrid practices represented genuine religious syncretism or simply political compromises designed to maintain social stability in regions where Christianity had been imposed over pre-existing belief systems. But documentary evidence suggests that even highly educated clergy sometimes participated in ceremonies that included elements they officially condemned as pagan superstition. The most elaborate fusion occurred during ceremonies performed in locations that had been sacred to pre-Christian peoples, long before they were designated as Christian holy sites. Ancient stone circles, sacred groves, and natural springs retained their spiritual significance for local populations even after churches were built nearby or over them. Wedding ceremonies performed in these locations often included rituals that honoured both the Christian and pagan spiritual associations of the sites. The plant materials used in these hybrid ceremonies included species that had been considered sacred by different pre-Christian traditions. Oak leaves honoured Celtic tree gods. Mistletoe carried Druidic blessings of fertility and protection, and certain wildflowers were believed to channel power from Germanic nature spirits. The careful incorporation of these materials into Christian ceremonial contexts required knowledge of both botanical properties and complex spiritual traditions that few people mastered completely. The music performed during these ceremonies often included melodies that predated Christian influences, though the lyrics were typically adapted to include Christian themes alongside references to older spiritual traditions. The musicians who specialized in these hybrid performances needed familiarity with diverse musical traditions and the ability to modify ancient songs to suit contemporary religious requirements while preserving their original spiritual power. The ceremonial objects used during these events frequently combined Christian symbols with pagan imagery in ways that created powerful spiritual artifacts while maintaining the appearance of orthodox religious practice. Crosses incorporated Celtic knotwork, chalices featured Germanic runic inscriptions, and altar cloths displayed patterns that reference both Christian and pre-Christian spiritual symbolism. The creation of these hybrid objects required artisans who understood multiple religious traditions and could blend them skillfully. The linguistic elements of these ceremonies included prayers and invocations that mixed Christian Latin with fragments of Celtic and Germanic languages that most participants no longer spoke fluently. The survival of these linguistic elements suggests that certain spiritual concepts from pre-Christian traditions were considered untranslatable into purely Christian contexts, requiring the preservation of original terminology to maintain their supposed effectiveness. The most controversial aspect of these hybrid practices was their inclusion of fertility rituals that honoured pre-Christian deities alongside Christian saints. The ceremonies included offerings to ancient gods and goddesses of reproduction, invocations of nature spirits associated with sexual potency, and symbolic acts that referenced mythological stories about divine marriages between pagan deities. The integration of these elements into Christian contexts required careful camouflage to avoid attracting unwanted attention from ecclesiastical authorities. The family traditions that preserved knowledge of these hybrid practices were typically maintained by women who passed information from mothers to daughters through generations, creating unbroken chains of cultural transmission that survived centuries of religious change. These women served as repositories of knowledge that combined herbal medicine, spiritual practice, and cultural history in ways that no formal educational institutions could match. The political implications of maintaining these hybrid traditions were significant because they provided continuity with the pre-Christian past while accommodating the political necessities of appearing religiously orthodox. Noble families could satisfy both the spiritual expectations of their subjects, who often retained strong attachments to ancestral traditions, and the religious requirements of church and state authorities who demanded Christian conformity. Marital failures and their consequences revealed the cruelest side of a social system that treated human intimacy as a political commodity, where personal inadequacy could trigger disasters that affected not only the couples involved, but also entire networks of family alliances, economic agreements, and military partnerships that depended on the successful consummation of political marriages. You observe the devastating aftermath when rumours begin to circulate that Philippe might have failed to fulfil his marital obligations, and how this possibility sends shockwaves through diplomatic circles that extend far beyond the immediate family concerns. The first signs of potential marital failure typically emerge during the mourning verification ceremonies, when matrons discovered insufficient evidence of consummation, or when their examinations revealed anatomical problems that had prevented successful intercourse. The social stigma associated with these failures was so intense that families routinely developed elaborate contingency plans for managing situations when marriages failed to achieve their primary objective of cementing political alliances through physical union. The consequences for men who failed to consummate their marriages were typically less severe than those faced by women, reflecting gender dynamics that attributed most reproductive problems to feminine inadequacy rather than masculine dysfunction. However, males who consistently failed to achieve consummation faced accusations of impotence that could destroy their political credibility and make them unsuitable for future alliance marriages. The most severe cases resulted in social exile, where men were effectively banned from participating in aristocratic society. Historians have documented numerous cases where families invested enormous resources in attempting to remedy matrimonial failures before admitting defeat and pursuing annulments. These remedial efforts included consulting medical specialists who promised to cure impotence or infertility, hiring magic practitioners who claim the ability to remove supernatural curses that might be preventing successful intercourse, and arranging replacement marriages with different partners who might prove more compatible physically or sexually. The women who were deemed responsible for matrimonial failures faced consequences that often included permanent damage to their marriage prospects, forfeiture of dowry payments, and social ostracism that extended to their entire families. The most tragic cases involved women whose physical anatomy made normal sexual intercourse impossible, condemning them to lives of spinsterhood in societies where unmarried women had virtually no legal rights or economic opportunities. Historians still debate whether the frequency of reported matrimonial failures reflected genuine medical problems or social pressures that created psychological barriers to successful sexual relationships. But documentary evidence suggests that the combination of public scrutiny, political pressure, and lack of education about sexual matters created conditions where even physically normal couples struggled to achieve satisfactory intimate relationships. The investigation procedures used to determine the causes of marital failure involved examinations that were often more invasive and humiliating than the original wedding night verifications. Medical experts examined both spouses to identify physical abnormalities, interviewed servants and family members to gather evidence about the couple's private behaviour, and sometimes required experimental intercourse attempts under supervised conditions to determine whether problems could be overcome with appropriate guidance or intervention. The legal processes for annulling failed marriages were complex and expensive, often requiring testimony from multiple expert witnesses. Detailed documentation of all remedial efforts that had been attempted, and approval from ecclesiastical authorities who needed to be convinced that annulment would not compromise church teachings about marriage permanence. The most contentious cases resulted in legal battles that lasted for years and consumed fortunes in attorney fees and court costs. The economic consequences of matrimonial failures extended far beyond immediate family losses because business partnerships, trade agreements, and military alliances built around marriage connections often collapsed when the underlying unions proved invalid. The ripple effects could destabilize entire regional economies, particularly in areas where single families controlled substantial territories or commercial enterprises that depended on political stability maintained through marriage networks. The social consequences for communities that had invested emotionally in celebrating marriages that subsequently failed included a loss of confidence in traditional matrimonial practices and increased skepticism about the effectiveness of religious and magical interventions designed to ensure marital success. The most dramatic failures sometimes triggered community-wide examinations of marriage customs and led to modifications in ceremonial practices aimed at preventing similar problems in future weddings. The medical understanding of sexual dysfunction was so primitive during this era that most treatment attempts relied more on superstition than scientific knowledge. The remedies included herbal preparations that might actually have been harmful, mechanical devices that often caused injury rather than improvement, and surgical procedures that were performed without adequate anesthesia or antiseptic techniques. The desperation of families facing matrimonial failure often made them vulnerable to exploitation by practitioners who promised miracle cures. The psychological trauma experienced by individuals who failed to achieve successful marital consummation often resulted in long-term problems that affected their ability to form intimate relationships, even when second marriage opportunities arose. The shame associated with public failure, combined with a lack of understanding about sexual matters, created emotional wounds that sometimes never healed completely, even when couples eventually learned to overcome their physical difficulties. The political ramifications of matrimonial failures included cancelled military campaigns, dissolved trade partnerships, and a realignment of diplomatic relationships that could alter the balance of power throughout entire regions. The most significant failures sometimes contributed to outbreaks of warfare when frustrated families sought to achieve through military conquest what they had failed to secure through peaceful marriage alliances. The prevention strategies developed by experienced families included more extensive pre-marriage medical examinations, psychological counselling designed to prepare couples for intimate relationships, and backup marriage arrangements that could be activated if primary unions failed to achieve their objectives. The most sophisticated families maintained networks of alternative alliance options that could be deployed rapidly when matrimonial strategies failed to produce desired results. The hidden legacy of these ancestral practices is inexorably intertwined with the wedding traditions we still practice today, creating invisible connections between the medieval rituals you have witnessed tonight and the modern ceremonies that millions of couples celebrate without even suspecting the turbulent and often macabre origins of their most cherished traditions. You gradually realize that every familiar element of contemporary weddings carries with it echoes of those medieval nights where blood, magic, and politics were intertwined in rituals that transformed intimacy into a public spectacle. The simple act of carrying a bridal bouquet connects directly to those sacred herbs that Marguerite hid in her dress to protect herself against lustful demons and to ensure supernatural fertility. The modern flowers that brides hold as they walk down the aisle are not just pretty decorations. They're evolutionary descendants of powerful amulets that our ancestors believed were literally capable of altering the destiny of entire marriages. The roses that provide petals for contemporary ceremonies were originally grown in monastic gardens where monks specializing in sacred botany developed varieties specifically designed for marriage rituals that combined Christianity with much older pagan traditions. The tradition of exchanging rings preserves vestiges of those blood exchange rituals where Marguerite and Philippe literally mixed their vital essences to create bonds that transcended death. The precious metals of modern rings were originally chosen not for their beauty but for their supposed alchemical properties to preserve and amplify spiritual connections between joined souls. Gold symbolized solar eternity, silver represented feminine lunar cycles, and special alloys incorporated elements that medieval alchemists considered essential for maintaining magical fidelity between spouses separated by distances or political circumstances. Historians have traced direct connections between white wedding dresses and those ceremonial sheets, where medieval families looked for physical evidence of marital consummation. The symbolism of white as purity is only a superficial interpretation of much more complex traditions that originally related this colour to supernatural abilities to reveal hidden truths about sexuality and fertility. White textiles were considered magical materials capable of capturing and preserving spiritual as well as physical evidence about the validity of marriage unions. Contemporary religious ceremonies retained fragmented elements of those hybrid rituals where Father Night combined Christian prayers with pagan incantations. Modern altars frequently occupy locations that were considered sacred by pre-Christian cultures, and many historic churches incorporate architecture that preserves symbols and geometric patterns originally designed to channel supernatural energies during marriage ceremonies that honoured both Christian saints and ancestral fertility deities. Modern wedding banquets preserve vestiges of those elaborate gastronomic rituals where each dish contained ingredients specifically chosen to stimulate fertility and ensure sexual compatibility between couples who often had only known each other for a few hours before their ceremonies. Contemporary wedding cakes descend directly from those culinary creations moulded into explicit anatomical shapes that served both nutritional and magical purposes. The traditions of feeding each other preserve echoes of rituals where the newlyweds consumed mixtures of their own blood, combined with aphrodisiacs and potions designed to alter their states of consciousness during their first intimate experiences. Historians still debate to what extent modern marriage traditions retain the psychological effectiveness of their magical origins, but anthropological evidence suggests that many contemporary rituals function in ways that their practitioners do not fully understand. The neurological processes activated by elaborate marriage ceremonies create emotional and hormonal bonds that transcend the conscious beliefs of the participants, suggesting that our medieval ancestors intuited truths about human psychology that modern science is only just beginning to understand systematically. Honeymoon traditions connect directly with those practices of ceremonial isolation, where newlyweds were protected by specialized defenders while they consolidated their physical and spiritual bonds away from familial and political interference. Modern romantic destinations frequently occupy locations that were considered especially conducive to sacred sexual activity: isolated islands, sacred mountains, and thermal springs that our ancestors associated with supernatural powers to enhance intimacy and marital fertility. Even seemingly innocuous traditions like throwing rice or petals preserve elements of those fertility rituals where entire communities actively participated in ceremonies designed to ensure that marriages produced abundant heirs. The grains thrown at contemporary couples represent domesticated versions of rituals that originally involved animal sacrifices, blood offerings, and invocations to deities specifically associated with human reproduction and dynastic continuity. Modern wedding photographs replace but also preserve the functions of those detailed documents, where medieval scribes recorded every aspect of marriage ceremonies for future legal and political reference. Contemporary albums create permanent records that families consult for generations, exactly like those parchments where the descriptions of nocturnal rituals served as evidence in disputes about the legitimacy of heirs and the validity of political alliances sealed by marriages. The contemporary wedding industry, with its planning specialists, ceremonial decorators, and event coordinators, evolved directly from those networks of practitioners who provided specialized services for noble families, the masters of nuptial ceremonies, the defenders of the threshold, the expert matrons in verification, and the hybrid priests who navigated between Orthodox Christianity and older magical traditions. As the first rays of dawn begin to filter gently through the castle windows, you feel these echoes of the past gradually fade, taking with them the shadows of rituals that once determined the fate of entire kingdoms. The sounds of the medieval night transform into the comforting silence of your own bedroom, where the traditions you have witnessed tonight continue to live, in forms we barely recognize but that still shape our lives in profound and mysterious ways. Every couple who exchanges wedding vows today carries within their ceremony the whispers of those ancestral nights where love, politics, magic, and survival were intertwined in rituals that transformed ordinary humans into repositories of family honor and dynastic ambition. The modern wedding traditions we consider natural and romantic are actually a sophisticated evolution of practices that once required courage, endurance, and faith in powers that transcended human understanding. As you drift towards sleep, surrounded by the gentle comfort of your contemporary world, remember that somewhere in the foundation of every marriage celebration lies the legacy of couples like Marguerite and Philippe, who faced their first nights together under pressures and expectations that tested not only their physical compatibility, but also their spiritual resilience and political wisdom. Their experiences, both tender and terrifying, created templates for human bonding that continue influencing how we approach love, commitment, and family formation centuries after their particular world disappeared into history. The ritual boundaries between sacred and secular, public and private, magical and mundane that seemed so important to our medieval ancestors perhaps matter less than the fundamental human needs those boundaries were designed to protect: the desire for lasting companionship, the hope for creating new life, and the faith that intimate connections between individuals can somehow transcend the limitations of mortality and create meaning that endures beyond any single lifetime. Sweet dreams, knowing that the most important elements of human bonding have remained remarkably constant throughout centuries of social change, and that the love you witness in modern ceremonies carries forward the same hopes and dreams that once filled medieval castle chambers with both terror and wonder, creating unbroken chains of human connection that link us eternally to ancestors whose courage in facing unknown futures mirrors our own daily acts of faith in love's enduring power.